Good morning, everyone. Today, I want to thank again Mr. Noah Barth for sending us another nice background. Noah, if you want to keep talking about Super Bowls and how many Super Bowls the Patriots have, you're welcome to join me on office hours. We can make this into a more wide-scale discussion. But thank you anyway for sending that. I'm really happy that you all guys are cooperating on that. Let's talk business. All right, so today's topic is political psychology. I'll get to that in a second, of course. We'll start, as usual, with a quick review of Thursday's meeting. So I talked about constructivism, the theory of constructivism in the context of world politics. The focus of the theory, instead of looking at the objectives themselves and how they lead to behavior, the theory actually addresses the process, how those objectives are formed. Introducing some of the concepts such as social intersubjectivity, how our shared ideas, our shared values lead to having also shared identities, and how that's going to shape our behavior. Norms, the fact that there's a lot of shared norms among different groups around the world is shaping their own shared identity, and how that shapes their behavior. I talked about the different examples in the context of IR, how shared norms actually provide different explanations to a balancing behavior. Instead of looking at strategic incentives for countries to form the two blocks of the Cold War. So the argument based on constructivism was that it was the shared norms of those states that led to their coming together in those two blocks and balancing one against another. Cooperation also based on shared identity and shared norms. Instead of looking at cooperation for the sense of self-interest, it's cooperation in order to drive more discourse, more deliberation, and get to higher values. But again, all of that is based on the fact that the two sides that coming into this cooperation agreement have incentives, have a shared identity, not incentives, and they prefer to work together instead of working unilaterally. Then I talked a lot about the limitations of constructivism, mostly in the context of whether this actually fits to a theory as a theory of IR, or it is better viewed as an analytic framework analytic framework to study behavior of individuals in international context. The many challenges that constructivism faces with empirical evidence that shows support for some of those arguments. And I finished up talking about the case of Uganda with the idea of norm diffusion, how transnational norms are internalized within state. In this case, it was norms about LGBT rights that have been imported in a way from the transnational acceptance of those norms, especially in the West, into some of those countries, in this case, Uganda, how that led to the backlash that was called, because it represented a political threat to the government and to some of those groups that opposed the norm. And that led eventually to this immunization aspect, which was the development of different legal barriers to block the advocacy and expression of those rights. And this is just one example to show how this process of constructivism works. And that's a pretty interesting one. I know that constructivism is a complex framework to comprehend. It has a lot of those very complicated concepts. And to understand how we get from one concept and understand how that concept all works with other aspects and how all that leads to behavior in international scale might be a little bit more complicated. If you have more questions about that, you're more than welcome to email them to me or to come talk to me, of course, on office hours. We can talk about it a little bit more. But again, with all the criticism and the limitations of this kind of theory, it still has a lot of benefits which we can use for explaining how individuals or how countries behave in international context. So that's constructivism. Our topic for today is political psychology. Political psychology offers a very different view on behavior in the international system. And the main difference is that we keep going further down the ladder of levels of analysis. And the focus for us today is on the individual decision maker. Instead of, we started at the system, we went to the nation state, talking about different approaches there as well. And now we're talking about the individual decision maker, whether it is political leader, whether it is member of the public. I'll talk about that also. in a few minutes. First question we may ask to think is why do we care? Why should we study individuals? We are exploring the behavior of states in the international system. I talked about the theories such as realism. Realism focused on the system, and it showed how different conditions within the system shape the behavior of the members of the system, which are the states. Even if you want to look at a less combative approach such as liberalism, liberalism was based on citizen preferences, which are individuals, but liberalism focused on the system, and it views the behavior of the states as actually the aggregation of those different individual views. So the individual was not the focus, the focus was the system, which was based on the aggregation of those views. So again, those are other approaches which provides us explanation about state behavior. So why should we use those kind of individual level explanations? And one of the central motivations is that individual level studies can account for some variations in outcomes in the international system that are much harder to explain based on structural conditions or state level factors. As an example, think about the way that both President Clinton and then President George W. Bush addressed the situation in Iraq. Both of them faced relatively similar types of information and conditions related to Iraq, but their actions were very, very different eventually. And if the structural conditions, if the domestic conditions are pretty much similar, then how can we explain those differences? Well, one way we can tackle this question is looking at the individual leaders and look for some answers. So that's part of the motivation to study that level. Now, over the last decade and a half, 2 decades, there's a substantial growth in research on that integrates psychological theories into the study of political science as a whole, and particularly study of IR. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I want to talk about some of them. First, some of the events over the last 20 years have had direct links with psychological theories. The 9/11 attacks provided us a lot of reasons to study the causes of terrorism at an individual level. Why do individuals join terrorism? Why do individuals go through a radicalization process? The Iraq War has provided us as actual cases to think about the limitations of rationalist explanations for war, like I talked about last week when I talked about the rational choice in war, as well as intelligence failures before the events of 9/11. So those are events that had a lot of association with psychological theories, and we wanted to study them in the context of IR. Another reason is the expansion of micro-level theories at the expense of system-level theories. One of the reasons for that is while system-level theories were highly dominant early on, a lot of those theories rely on micro-level assumptions. So the assumption of the unitary actor decides by default that the differences between the individual within the state do not matter. That's an assumption of the theory, but again, it's based on a micro-level assumption. We assume that those differences do not matter, so we can make the larger scale assumption that the country behaves on one level. So unitary assumption for realism in this case. So a growth in the interest of scholars regarding different mechanisms and different processes that lead to some outcomes offered a lot more room for psychological approaches that focus on those causal chains. So looking more into those processes, into those mechanisms that explain the outcomes, it led to a lot more interest in the micro level at the expense of the system or the macro level. And lastly, this is more of how the field has changed. In the past, the psychological and the rationality approaches were seen as contrasts. So those two schools of thought tend to doubt each other, especially when scholars in each side of this divide tend to doubt the reality of the assumptions. So how much does the method that some of those approaches rely on actually fit reality? For example, how much does experiments used by psychologists fit reality? Or on the other hand, how much does the unitary actor represent reality? So those were some of the debate. But over the last really 15 years, there's been a lot of developments in terms of both theory as well as methods that put those two approaches much closer to one another, how they complement one another, and how we can use both of them actually to explain political behavior. Now, I want to, before going into the specific elements of those different approaches, the different approach of political psychology, I want to talk about what does this increase in research on political psychology looks like. So in the paper that you had, one of the papers you had to read for today, the authors use different visualizations to show how the change looks in terms of research on political psychology. They used article submissions from a 4-year span to one of the top IR journals to show some of those trends. So first, what this figure shows us is the proportion of submissions based on the type. So the red ones represent proportion of submissions for political psychology studies, and the blue is all the rest. So first, what we see here is the different methodological tools used. So political psychology studies rely a lot more on more diverse methods, mostly because they focus on the individual decision makers, which compels us to use methods such as experiments and surveys, which are less prevalent. They were at least less prevalent in other topic fields of research. And that means that we have to integrate or incorporate methods that come from a lot of other disciplines, such as psychology or economics, into our studies of international relations. So that's one example of how research has shifted based on that. The other one is the idea of the issues that are studied. Political psychology is focusing on studying foreign policy decision-making and international security. That's what you see here, the dominance of those submissions, while other theories are testing a lot of others. You can see a lot less in terms of, for example, international political economy. I'm going to talk about that. The third point is issue areas. So the focus, again, for political psychology studies has been mostly public opinion, followed by political violence from different nature. The interesting aspect of this and the expansion of using psychological approaches and methods here is the fact that a lot of the trends in political violence has been, we use public opinion to study them. So we ask for public opinion and test public opinion in the context of political violence instead of just focusing on leaders, which is another topic I'm going to talk about. So that's kind of the state of the field of political psychology over the last decade, and that keeps expanding. I'm going to talk a little bit more about other areas of research. The most focused psychological approach that has been introduced and used to explain many issues in IR is, now we can see that, is prospect theory. Prospect theory was officially introduced in an economics journal in 1979. It was devised by two former Israeli scholars by the name of Tversky and Kahneman. It got a lot of attention, and in 2002, those two scholars have won the Nobel Prize in Economics for their work on that. The essence of prospect theory is studying decision-making in the face of conditions of uncertainty and risk. And it is based on a lot of experimental evidence that those scholars have collected, suggesting that many deviations exist by the way that individuals actually make decisions, and those are deviating from the rational choice model. A lot of the assumptions and the expected behavior that the rational choice model has proposed, in reality, viewed like people do not follow that. So that's what led to them discuss about, that's what led to the formulation of prospect theory. And you can see in this picture here is one example for one of the main questions that I'm going to talk about. So prospect theory has a lot of different elements, and I want to focus on some of them. First, one of the primary elements in this case is what's called reference dependence. Our choices in any kind of context are driven by how sensitive we are to gains and losses, but those gains and losses are not from an overall situation, overall state, or an overall welfare standpoint, but actually from certain reference points, which means we care more about how much we gain and how much we lose with respect to some relative state. This role of reference dependence is critical. We tend to overvalue losses compared to similar size gains. So for example, experimental evidence has shown that people are less likely to accept a lottery, which offers them 50% chance of losing some amount compared to 50% winning, the same amount. And this kind of a behavior, which again, it's the same probability to gain or lose the same amount, reflects what's called loss aversion. Loss aversion suggests that we value things that we possess much more than things that we do not possess. In other words, I will demand much more for a product or something that I own compared to how much I'm willing to pay for that same product. As an example, if I own a watch that I care a lot about and my friend wants to buy that for me, the amount of money I'm going to demand from that friend is going to be much more than how much I'll be willing to pay for that same watch if my friend had this watch. That's loss aversion. That's my watch. I will value it as much more, and I'm not willing, and I'm going to demand much more from that. That's the idea of loss aversion. Reference points which leads to loss aversion is usually the current state, which is the status quo, and that leads me to talk about what's is termed the status quo bias. A shift from the status quo bias, which involves cost, is seen as a loss, and any benefits moving away from that same status quo, the same situation I'm facing right now, is seen as gain. But again, just like loss aversion, we tend to overvalue losses compared to gain. So that means we would much rather prefer to remain in the status quo situation than moving away. We would prefer to make a choice that's going to keep us in where we are now in order to avoid from a loss, which is costly, compared to the potential to gain more when I'm shifting away from my status quo. That also relates to the idea of a sunk cost. We will keep investing in some kind of decision that we made because we already invested in that already. We made some kind of resources were invested in that decision. And we view that if we decide to just abandon that kind of path, that is viewed as a loss. Think about it. On the top of my head, one of the examples I can think about is a selection of a quarterback, #1 overall in the NFL draft, and that quarterback sucks. Now, this quarterback is going to get a lot more opportunities to improve and to play, even if he sucks, because that's a sunk cost, because I've made a pretty substantial investment in that player, for that example, and I'm not willing to give up on that yet. That's a sunk cost. That's the idea of a sunk cost. In terms of the choices that we make based on those kinds of elements, so again, the persistence in failing policies. So this illustration provides us some example for the persistence in failing policies in the corporate world. We're not going to risk anything new. We'll just play it safe. Again, status quo bias, and continue our slow decline in this example into obsolescence, which is I will persist in a policy which is not useful for me because I'm at a loss position and I'm not willing to take the risk out of it. So that's in the corporate dimension. In the political dimension, we can think about the wars in Afghanistan, the persistence of the war in Afghanistan, the persistence of the war that the Soviets had in Afghanistan as well, and the American invasion to Iraq is another example in this case. So that's the idea of loss aversion, status quo bias, and sunk cost when it comes to political choices. Prospect theories also address these different elements in the context of our risk profile. So the main argument in this aspect is that risk attitudes are based on our view of a particular situation, and our view is our reference to that situation is the status quo, and not necessarily the returns we may have from that specific decision. In other words, any kind of variations in our risk profile depends on our perception of the situation and its relations to the status quo. As an example, let's look at those variations. When we are in what's called the domain of gain, such as this guy here who already won something, we tend to behave in a way who is risk averse because that's the status quo. We don't want to get any losses from the status quo. So like this guy offers here, we prefer to take a sure bet and not lose anything because I just won already. So my new status quo is my gain dimension. On the other hand, when we are in what's called the domain of losses, we've already lost some, we tend to exhibit a lot more of a risky behavior because we want to compensate from that loss. Like this guy here. He already lost something and he's in this domain of loss, but he wants to compensate for that. He's willing to take a lot more risks in that nature. That's the idea behind the gambling example of double or nothing. I've lost a certain amount of, let's call it money. I lost $500 in a bet, and I'm offered now to double that and win back what I lost and get more. And that's true, that's a possibility. But there's also a possibility that I keep more, that I keep losing, I'm sorry. So I may lose even more than I already lost. That's the idea. I'm willing to take the risk and bet on this double or nothing proposition because I've already lost. And if I won $500, I'll never get this. I will never accept this double or nothing proposition. That's the idea. And both of those kinds of choices, in a way, deviate from a rational decision process. And that's the idea behind it. Now, moving away from the example of gambling, which I do not support, into our own area of the world of international relations, we can think about former Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and his decision to go to war in 1973. One of the main factors that went into this decision was his view of the loss of the Sinai Peninsula. He viewed that as Egyptian territory. So in 1967, Israel and Egypt and other Arab countries also engaged in war. At the end of the war, Israel has gained control over that area. That means that in the terminology of prospect theory, Sadat was in the domain of loss. So again, translating that to risk profile, he was willing to take the risk of war in order to compensate for that loss and to gain that territory back. Even though after having 3 different wars in Israel, he knew that the odds of winning the war, especially from a military standpoint, were very, very questionable, let's put it this way. But he was willing to take the risk because he was in that domain of loss. That's one way in which prospect theory will explain that decision. Let's go back from former President Sadat. And all of those different elements and those different mechanisms that I talked about related to prospect theory, all of them relate to the way that we frame the situation that we view. The way we perceive the situation we face is highly important for the choice that we make. All of us have been to the Walmart in the past and said, yes, if we have those 2 options, we will prefer to take the 80% fat-free yogurt, even though an 80% fat-free yogurt suggests a 20% fat yogurt. So the way that this is framed affects our decision in this context. So this is an important one. And the most famous example for that is the Asian disease problem, which has too many similarities to the state of our world today, unfortunately, and that's really coincidental now at this point. This is based on an experiment conducted also by Tversky and Kahneman way back in the 1980s, and I'll talk about that for a few minutes so I can give you a better example of what am I talking about when I say framing is a very important aspect in the way that we make decisions. So according to this story, the United States faced an outbreak of unusual disease expected to kill 600 people. We wish that today that was the number we were facing. And the people that were answering this specific experiment, this specific survey, had to choose between 2 different programs in order to address that disease. Now, on the left-hand side, you have one group of people, one experiment that was conducted, and then on the right-hand side, I'm going to talk about them separately. So in this case, program A offers the possibility of saving 200 people out of those 600, for sure. 600 will be saved. That's one option. Program B, according to that program, there is a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved. So everybody will be saved, and that's the probability is 1/3. And there's a 2/3 probability that nobody is going to be saved. Now, if you use and compare those 2 programs, which is what you need to do when you make this kind of decision, because the question for those in the experiment was which one of those would you prefer? And if you follow the rational choice model, you should derive your expected outcomes in this case. And 1/3 probability of 600 means that 200 will be saved, which is essentially, if we go back to program A, it's exactly the same thing. So you have 200 people will be saved here, and 1/3 probability means 200 people will be saved here. 2/3 probability that nobody will be saved means that 400 people will die, which again means 200 people will be saved. So again, essentially, from a rational standpoint, those two programs offer the same outcome. You want to know how many people, which program was more popular? So the vast majority of people preferred program A. It's seen as the more safe option, and I'll talk about that in a second. Now let's talk about the other combination of programs. In this case, program A will lead to the fact that 400 people will die. Okay, that's pretty simple. Program B, and there's a typo here in this picture, I'm sorry about that, but there's a 1/3 probability that nobody will die, so 600 people will be saved, and 2/3 probability that everybody will die. And again, if we follow the rational choice model, we do those expected outcomes, we should get the same number. 1/3 probability of 600 means that 200 people will not die. So which means that 400 people will die. So essentially, again, just like this example here, program A and program B offer the same expected outcome. So there shouldn't be any difference in the level of support of those that respond to the survey. And for this second version, most people actually favored program B. Now let's think about those two outcomes in the context of risk profile, framing, and prospect theory. So program A was what's called the risk-averse option. Why? Because this is framed as a gain. That's the framing, that's how framing and loss aversion and risky choices come together. This is framed as a gain, 200 people will be saved, so I would prefer to take that action and not take any kind of risks. Now here, the vast majority of people actually preferred the gamble in a way. I gambled on the fact that on the third probability that nobody will die. That's because those two programs were framed in the domain of loss. So I was willing to take the risk. And that's exactly the difference between those. And that's exactly why framing matters. When countries decide to go to war, a lot of times soldiers unfortunately die. And one way that politicians on some level try to justify those decisions is by framing the outcomes of the battle. So those soldiers have died in the service of their country in order to preserve our freedom, in order to expand in order to export our democratic ideology. Even if in reality, in some cases, those kinds of decisions are not the most rational decisions, but that's the power of framing. So prospect theory offered us a lot of different examples to how individuals deviate from the more, at the time, accepted a rational choice model, which talks about, of course, maximizing our own utility. But one of the main criticisms on prospect theory was it was rather lack of clear structure. So instead of offering a very coherent theory, which offers clear predictions based on very certain conditions, it was mostly viewed as a list of biases. I talked about reference dependence, and I talked about the status quo bias and loss aversion and framing problems. This seems like a grocery list of biases, all of them representing real world evidence, right? But it wasn't viewed like a clear theory. So this was the main criticism, and some of it is still relevant today. But on the other hand, prospect theory and everything that was based on prospect theory has been highly influential in the discipline of behavioral economics, as well as other social sciences like political science. For that matter, as I said, the two original authors of prospect theory have won a Nobel Peace Prize and Nobel Prize in economics for their work. And a couple of years ago, another person which studied behavioral economics, which is also closely related to prospect theory, and that's Richard Thaler, also won an economics Nobel Prize. So this work, while it has its own limitation, has a lot of insights and is very influential. I want to move away from prospect theory and talk about other psychological elements. A lot of them actually relate to some of the findings in prospect theory, but they are going beyond that, and they provided explanations on individual behavior in that context, and how in some cases that deviates from what we may view as irrational decision patterns. First, let's talk about emotions. A lot of research in psychology has showed that emotions play a critical role in affecting the way that we make decisions, any kind of decisions for that matter. So in the context of political psychology and international relations, a lot of the earlier work highlighted cognitive limitations, what's called cold cognitions, and how those limitations impair the decision-making processes. So I talked a lot about all those different elements within the prospect theory framework. I'll also talk a little bit more about heuristics, which are different mental shortcuts that we use in order to address the amount of information we have to deal with every day. So that's heuristics. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And that's the earlier work. Recent work over the last 15 or 20 so years tend to address hot cognition. Hot cognition are emotional reactions, how those emotional reactions affect our political choices. In addition, while the earlier work on emotions tend to look at those two big clusters of emotions, negative emotions versus positive emotions, the recent studies tends to decompose those big clusters and look at very specific discrete emotions. In the context of IR, a lot of them are mostly the negative ones, such as anger, anxiety, and fear. Some of the research in the context of IR again, anger is a very prominent emotional reactions that IR scholars are studying. So scholars have used surveys to measure how anger affects public preferences regarding different counterterrorism tools. And their argument in that sense for that specific paper, which you will have at the end of the slides today as part of the recommended readings, they argued that anger served as a mediator for costly terror incidents and increase the support of respondents, those who express feelings of anger, to support offensive counterterrorism tools such as using drone strikes. So facing terrorism incident, which was very costly, those who are more angry, are more likely to support an offensive kind of response using drones for that matter. That was one study they used. Overall, the events of 9/11 offered a lot of context to study emotions in the field of national security. Studies addressed different emotional reactions led by anger, anxiety, and fear, how those emotions translate to certain policy preferences, whether it is the use of military force in this as a response to those kinds of threat. But a lot of the studies also addressed policies which are more domestic in nature. For example, how we supporting policies such as restrict the entry of certain ethnic groups into the United States or other countries for that matter. And this kind of policy option speaks to a related issue for that, which is what's called the civil liberties security dilemma. This kind of research talks about the questions, it weighs the questions of how much are we willing as citizens in a democratic country, how much are we willing to forego some of our basic human rights in order to enhance national security. For example, in terms of some of those rights, how much we're willing to accept more strict screening protocols in our international airport, which means that it's going to take us, instead of 30 minutes from the minute we go into the airport until we go to the gate, it's going to take us 2 hours. Are we willing to accept that cost? Some will. I'll give you a more extreme example, because you may think about waiting in the airport is not that bad. Well, if there is a potential threat of terrorism, let's say in College Station, there isn't, let's just say that. Are we willing to accept the fact that we allow the government to track cell phone communication in order to identify those? Are we willing to do that in order to enhance our security? Overall, the research in that literature shows that people are accepting that. Especially, a lot of this research is based on American citizens that were done here in the United States, and a lot of them has showed that the public is willing to accept some restrictions on their civil liberties in order to potentially enhance our security dilemma. Now, a lot of those findings are based on individual level mechanism, such as how important my perception of the issue, how important that is, how much do I trust the government, How effective do I think is the policy that is being offered to address the security threat and stuff like that. But again, this is emotional reactions and individual level mechanism and how they lead to different political responses. Over the last couple of years, there's been a little bit even more developments in studying emotions. Scholars have used actual physical traits related to emotional responses in order to measure individual level preferences. I'm sorry. So based on some insights from biochemistry literature, researchers has employed an experimental work where they measured emotional arousal. Some of them were in measuring different chemical combinations in our saliva, and to see how that reflects actual an emotional reaction and how that affects decision making. What they showed is that emotional reactions, which in their research manifested as physical different chemical combinations on their body, leads to the adoption of suboptimal choices. In their context, it was in the setting of a credible commitment. But overall, the bottom line of this research is that negative emotional reactions harm optimal decision-making and increase our reliance on the more simplistic kind of decision rules, such as heuristics. So that's emotions. Another area of research regarding individual preferences related to individual beliefs. Individual beliefs are based on how we process information from the environment. The problem is that when we are collecting information from the environment, we are liable to face misperceptions of the situation. And those misperceptions may be a function of mechanisms such as heuristics, using the wrong analogies, or biases such as cognitive dissonance. Many of these biases and outcomes relate to our difficulties as humans to make proper statistical inferences. We tend to place greater value on evidence which is available to us and support our preconceptions of some kind of an idea. We tend to ignore information which is harder to obtain or information which contradicts our views. And we fail to understand what is a basic, what's called base rates of different events in order to predict future outcomes. To give you an example of those different mechanisms and how they may lead to misperceptions, I want to talk about the availability heuristic. Availability heuristic was one of the 3 heuristics that were introduced in one of the famous papers written by Kahneman and Tversky. It was actually published a few years before the prospect theory paper. It was published back in the early 1970s, and you have that paper as well listed in the recommended readings if you want to read about that. It's a very short and interesting paper. According to the availability heuristic, we tend to overvalue outlier cases and dramatic events because it's easy for us to remember those kinds of events when we think about predicting those kinds of events in the future. And at the same time, we ignore the base rate, which is the actual probabilities that those kinds of events, especially if that's rare events, may happen. And the easiest examples to think about how likely it is that myself and each and every one of you will be a victim of terrorism here in College Station, here in Texas, or here in the United States. When we think about terrorism, the easiest thing for us to think about is 9/11, whether you remember more about the events that happened in Europe over the last 3 or 4 years, the events in the Middle East, in Africa. So big dramatic events such as 9/11, which is the biggest and most dramatic event in that context, is easier for us to remember, and that may lead us to make the wrong inferences about how likely it is that I'm going to be a victim of terrorism. Well, in reality, considering the number of people in the United States and the number of terrorist events that happened here over the last 20 years, the probabilities are very, 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 very low. So that's the idea. It's much more easier for us it's available to us to think about those dramatic events when we have to address the questions, how likely am I to be a terrorism victim? And that's the idea behind it. And that's part of misperception. A related idea in the context of misperception relates to predictions offered by experts. So a lot of research in IR addressed the questions of the possibility, how does experts versus non-experts offer predictions in their areas of expertise. And a lot of this research shows that experts are not necessarily better at predicting those outcomes than any common man. Experts who have strong ideologies tend to be very poor forecasters, mostly because they will tend to emphasize in their analysis, in their prediction, one causal path that they are expert in, and they will favor this causal path instead of thinking about the actual probability or frequency of that event. So those experts will overestimate different threats, if we're thinking about it in the context of national security, when they know the causal path. And this quote that you have here from former Vice President Cheney from 2001 provides clear examples for that. Because he was aware of the potential causal path of Pakistan, nuclear weapons, and Al-Qaeda, he emphasized that and completely ignored the base rates or the actual probability of events. When he said that the 1% chance is a 100% chance, that's exactly this misperception. And how exactly does experts such as former Vice President Cheney may have those kinds of errors in their assessments. Now, misperceptions are not just in the context of how do I perceive the situation and think about external events or external situations. So that means toward others, towards Pakistan and Al-Qaeda in this quote example. It also means that I'm misperceiving my own situation, my own capabilities, for example. Many bargaining failures, and I talked a little bit about bargaining failures without going into the psychological aspect of it. When I talked about the rational choice, if you remember, the fear and paper talked about overestimation of capabilities, which may lead to war. And misperceptions of my own capabilities can be part of that. My wrong assessment of my own capabilities may lead me, or may lead my leader, my president, my prime minister, to engage in war when we're not really ready. Those kinds of wrong assessments based on misperception may lead to overconfidence in engaging in, it doesn't have to be war, it can be going into international negotiation situations and stuff like that. But those are psychological mechanisms that may lead to the wrong choices, especially it may lead to mostly choices that deviate from what we think is a rational decision process. Another area of research where psychology is very useful is studying public opinion, and specifically the differences between individual preferences and society preferences. So many of the psychological models distinguish between individual preferences and societal preferences. Most of those theories reject the rational assumption of self-interest and egoistic behavior. I'm mostly emphasizing my own self-benefits when I'm making any kind of decisions. That's one of the assumptions that psychological models reject. What a lot of this research has shown that we tend to deviate from maximizing our own expected utility, and we actually make choices that provide less clear benefits to us, but we care more about the aggregate benefits of society. So that essentially we're concerned with social outcomes, which deviates us from rational self-interest based assessment. So, and the evidence for that is in various different fields. I'm going to talk about that in a minute in the context of political choices. First, I want to give you an example from one of the original studies, the original formulations that found that, and that's called the dictator game. If you're familiar with that, then you should know about the specific outcome. I don't know if you're related to how that shows societal preferences. The idea behind a dictator game is that two individuals are playing a game. One of them is called the proposer, the other one is the responder. The proposer has to split a certain stake, in this case, just to have here this X, among those two individuals. Let's say that this is $100. The responder responds for this offer. If he accepts that, then they will split it based on the proposed by proposer. So if the proposer said, I'm going to give you I'm going to keep $90 to myself and give you $10, and the responder accept that, then everything's good. That's how they split this money. If the responder decides to reject that offer, then both of those individuals get nothing. That's the idea. Now, if we follow that with a rational choice framework, then the responder should accept any offer which is not zero. Any offer in which he gets something should be accepted, because it's better for him to get something than get nothing. The proposer at that time also knows that, should think about that and know that if his rival, if the other actor should behave in a strategic, rational manner, that means that the best offer for the proposer, the most rational and maximizing his own self-utility offer should be, I will offer you 1 cent and keep to myself $99.99. Because again, from a strictly rational standpoint, the responder should say, yes, I take that, because getting 1 cent is better getting than nothing. Want to make it less extreme? Let's say I'm giving you $2 and I'm keeping $98 to myself. It's better to get $2 than get $0. That's the rational interpretation of this game setting. However, a lot of experimental evidence has shown that in many cases, the proposals were not that extreme. If that's $100, let's say, so they were 50-50, so they were 60-40, so they were 55-45, those kinds of different distributions of the money. And what the scholars and the experimenters have came to realize is that people care a lot about the social outcomes. We care about the fact that we are in an interaction here with another person, so we can't think only about ourselves. And that's the idea behind caring about individual versus social preferences in that concept. Also within the social context, we can think about social identity as an important driver of our own individual beliefs. When individuals place a lot of weight on their own social identity, then some of their preferences, some of their behavior may be driven by those kinds of considerations and emotional reactions, rather than following a strategic, rational choice calculation. For example, those who have strong attachment to their national identity tend to view countries which behave tend to view other countries in a negative way, and some countries in a positive way, even if those two countries have the same kind of strategic behavior. So for that matter, if North Korea and Japan, both of them have engaged in actions which are not positive from the standpoint of, let's say, strong American supporters, right? So we will attribute negative intentions to North Korea because we dislike North Korea, but we will attribute positive intentions or benign intentions to Japan because we like Japan, even though their actions were the same. I don't know, any kind of military exercise in that area, any kind of testing of missiles, any kind of actions in the financial world. It doesn't matter the action in this case. But if their action is the same and we have some strong social attachment to our national perceptions, that may affect how we view those countries and what kind of actions we think we should implement against them. Much more fitting into the idea of individual versus social preferences and public policies and economic policy preferences. I will talk about it a lot more, when I'm going to talk about the political economy next week. But a lot of public preferences when it comes to economic policy are driven by what's called sociotropic views, which is the perception of the economy as a whole rather than my own individual economic status when I'm offering my opinion about certain economic policies. There are other individual level aspects such as nationalism or level of racism that affects those kinds of choices. For example, I talked already about trade policies and protection policies when I talked about the liberal theory. And again, we'll talk about it a lot more next week. But individuals that support protectionist policies are in many cases driven by this kind of sociotropic view, social preferences, because they believe that those kinds of policies will help poor people or will help certain groups in society which suffer from trade. So for example, protectionist policies for farmers, I don't get any benefits from that, but I want to make sure that farmers are okay. So I support protectionist policies. Now again, think about it from a rational standpoint. I support a policy which harm my own economic welfare because that policy potentially helps other people. That's the idea behind sociotropic views and economic preferences. There are other individual psychological related factors that have an effect here. In this case, one individual level factor that matters for this preferences in terms of the economic policies is education and knowledge. So some of the research has shown that even when we describe to individuals the adverse effects of trade barriers, they still cannot understand it, and they still follow this sociotropic views. But when we clarify to individuals the benefits of open trade, then there's some kind of change in their preferences. Those who are highly educated tend to adopt a more self-interest, rational point of view, which means more support for open trade, compared to those who are less educated, who tend to keep opposing free trade in that case. And that can be termed on some level as a more altruistic view, because again, I'm paying the price in order to make sure that farmers, in this case, are in a better shape. That's the idea behind it, and that's the difference between an individual preference and societal preference or benefits. Okay, so I talked a lot about the different elements, the different mechanisms, the different examples for political psychology literature and how that explains behavior in the international context. And as all the theories we talked about so far, I want to talk a little bit about limitations for this approach. So there are two main challenges or limitations. Both of them are kind of related to one another. The first one is what's called the aggregation problem. The analytic focus of this approach is the individual. But then we face the problem of how do we translate these findings of individuals' opinions to the explanation of state behavior? How do we get from an individual responding to a survey about American foreign policy versus Japan to actual behavior or the actual policy that America is going to implement against Japan? One way, in some ways, the easier solution, which is adopted by rational choice approach, and that's the idea of a rational choice, is to simplify reality, and that's the unitary actor assumption. It doesn't matter that there's differences in the opinions of different members of a society. We follow the unitary actor assumption. Another option is to stay focused on the individual, but look at different ways in which those individuals' beliefs or preferences are actually aggregated. One example in this case is when we focus on public opinion and how public opinion drives states' actions, especially in the context of democracy. So public opinion is the aggregation or the total sum of individual level attitudes. Political leaders in democracies face constraints because of public opinion, because they face electoral elections. If the leaders of the country will not follow the opinion of the majority of the public in certain actions, those political leaders may be voted out of office in the next elections. So that provides incentives for those leaders, which represents the state behavior, to actually behave in a way which is similar to the individual citizen's opinion. That's one way to think about how the individual citizen's opinion actually represents the behavior or the preference of the state. That's the idea behind that. I'm going to talk a lot more about the idea of public opinion as a constraint when it talks about democracies in a few weeks. But that's one way to think about the aggregation problem in this context. The second problem is related to that, and that's what's called external validity. Most of the empirical studies, most of the empirical tests of political psychology studies use either random or convenient samples of the public. In some cases, we use students in order to test our psychological theories. And the challenge in this case is how can we generalize from the opinion of 1 or 300 Texas A&M undergraduate students to elite decision makers face stressful, uncertain foreign policy situation? How is it possible to make this kind of generalization? Now, again, the answer here is related also to things I talked about in the aggregation problem. The first answer in this case is what's called replication, which means that if I find something in a sample of 300 students, I do not necessarily right away get the conclusions based on that. This is how my president will behave, the way that the student behaves. I replicate my study over multiple samples. I do a lot more student samples, and then I do a sample of the American population, and then I do a sample of the American population in a different place in the country in order to get as much evidence as possible that my theoretical psychological mechanism actually works, which means if it works from different samples, for samples that I collected across the entire United States of adults over 18, sample of students in Texas A&M, sample of students in Berkeley, and sample of students in Alabama, in all of those samples, in different contexts also. One was questions about military interventions, the other was questions about international negotiations, and always my psychological mechanism, whatever that was, led to the same outcome. That means that my theory is sound. And that's what important is, that my psychological mechanism is relevant to any decision maker. It doesn't matter if it is a student in Texas A&M or Berkeley, or an American citizen living in New York or living in Montana for that matter. So that means if my theory is relevant to any decision maker, it should be also relevant for elite decision maker. In the best case, you also run those kinds of studies on using elite samples. And there are studies that do just that. They collect elite samples, whether it is military officers, whether it is diplomats. The Chicago Council is one place that does surveys on elites and collects their opinions on different foreign policy issues. And you try to replicate the same types of tests on an elite sample and see if you can find the same outcomes. So that's one way to address that. Some of the important things we have to do when we apply those kinds of studies is that we need to have a clear theory. We need to ensure we have random assignment, which is one of the requirements of a proper experimental setting, which means that if I have 100 people in my sample and I have 2 different options to offer to each one of them, to 2 different variations of the policy, I have to make sure that I, in a complete random way, assign 50 of those people from my sample to one version of the policy and another 50 to the other version in order to make sure that they are randomly assigned in order to account for that. Also offering, if there is the option of scope condition, which means that my decision model relates to specific conditions. So it's not every decision in politics. It can be decisions in foreign policy. It can be decisions in war. It can be decision in negotiation. So that's part of the way in which I account for the fact that I need to generalize from my finding, which relate to whether it is students or members of the public, to elite decision makers. For the last couple of minutes that I'm left with, I want to finish talking about some of the new areas of research in the context of political psychology. First, we're going to talk about it also in future weeks, but studying issues of resolve, reputation, and different types of individual preferences. So political psychology research tests decision-making in foreign policy related to individual preferences of time. How do we perceive time? This is actually part of the topics which I address in my own dissertation. Rational choice model assume that we tend to discount the future in a fixed manner, which means that I tend to emphasize the short term, what's happening now, and I care less about the future, but it doesn't matter which point in the future, it's always the same rate of how much I care less about. Studies in psychology and also in political psychology have proposed that we tend to actually exhibit what's called hyperbolic discounting, which means which means that we highly discount the near future. So we care mostly about the immediate outcomes. We don't really care about what's happening in, 2 or 3 weeks from now. We care a little bit more of what's going to happen in 1 or 2 years. So that means that our perception of the time in terms of the outcome of our decision is changing depending on the time frame we're thinking about. Now, for those kinds of findings, it has an important implications for IR because this dynamic can be problematic for models of cooperation because strategies of reciprocity, which require caring about outcomes now, may be less likely, Reciprocity now may lead to good cooperation in the future, but it also means it's going to have to lead to cooperation now. But if I care more about the short term, when I go into a negotiation table, I want to get the most outcome, the most benefits that I can from that negotiation now. So that's one problem related to that. Other studies addressed questions about resolve and individual preferences related to time and risk preferences. Studies showed how those individual level elements are critical for shaping the extent of resolve, and resolve is framed in the context of how much am I willing to continue fighting in a war even though I'm suffering costs. Using some of the experimental work of the last couple of years, studies have shown that those who are patient, so their time preferences sense that they tend to discount the future less. They care more about the future. So patient individuals are less sensitive to the cost of conflict in the context of human casualties, and they display more resolve. So patient people place more value on the long-term outcomes of the conflict. So, and they're willing to accept immediate cost in order to accomplish those future outcomes. That's the idea of time preferences and resolve. Risk preferences and resolve is a little bit different. The effect is not that clear, because risk aversion tends to reduce the degree of resolve because I'm very sensitive to the cost of the conflict. So I'm less resolved in keeping on fighting even though I'm paying a lot of cost. At the same time, risk-averse individuals also worry about reputational cost from stopping the conflict. So that means that the effect of risk preferences in the context of resolve and reputation is a non-linear effect in that case. Before going into the last emerging areas of research, I want to stop for the attendance word of today. Attendance word of today is orange. Orange, like the color, is the attendance word for today. All right, so let's finish up really with the last couple of what can be viewed as the emerging fields of research. The first is what's called the first image reversed. First image is the study of the international system. So recent work addressed how events in the international system affect individuals. So instead of looking at how individual behavior, which is what political psychology actually does, affect behavior in international context, it's exactly the opposite. How does the international events affect individuals? For example, studies addressed the effects of exposure to conflict on individual preferences. There's a study from 2015 that was done on Israelis that served in the military and were exposed to actual combat conditions. And it showed that their support for negotiations with rivals was actually lower. At the same time, other research has shown that political leaders which had exposure to combat were less likely to initiate conflict. And that's an interesting topic we're going to talk about a little bit more when we talk about leaders on our next meeting. Also, violence in the international context has clear political effects, and it can affect voting patterns. Studies conducted in Israel and other countries in Europe have shown that exposure to violence, such as terrorism, has an effect on the types of votes that people are doing. So that's one area of research that is expanding. Another important development in the study of political psychology has been the turn to, there it is, the turn to evolutionary approaches to explain individual preferences and individual behaviors. For example, using studies about genetics or biology to explain behavior. Some studies have talked about how different gene structure among individuals drive higher degrees of aggressive behavior in response to provocation, which is general in behavior of individuals, but also has effects in the context of IR. One of the earlier works on this specific topics in the context of international relations has been the work of Rosen. He used evolutionary biology to explain behavior in the international context. He looks at biological aspects of individuals along with the effects of environmental stimuli, so facing different situational conditions, show how high level of testosterone and the tendency to exhibit dominant behavior will increase, and will also increase the propensity to fight for reputation. So reputation is a clear IR concept. Those who have high level of testosterone and tend to exhibit dominant behavior are more likely to fight for reputation. That's one finding that he showed. Other research in using neuroscience explained how face-to-face diplomacy actually reduced the extent of uncertainty about the intentions of my rivals. So that's another way to use those kinds of evolutionary approaches. Research also addressed the decision-making process itself. Rational choice models tend to assume that the process is relatively simple. We assess all the different alternatives and select the one which offers the highest expected utility. In reality, a lot of the research in political psychology has shown that there's a lot of factors within the process that matters to the choice. For example, the order of the alternatives that we face. So if we have to make a policy decision, if military intervention is offered first, that's going to matter to how much I'm going to support that compared to if military intervention is going to offer third. The size of this menu of options that I'm choosing from, whether I'm choosing from 3 options or whether I'm choosing from 6, is going to matter. How complex they are, it's going to matter. Overall, what those studies have argued, including my own research, by the way, is that decision makers, when they face those kinds of challenges, will tend to favor the familiar kind of alternatives, the available, the salient alternatives, which sometimes will be a suboptimal choice. I'll finish up with 2 more topics that we'll address over the next lecture. So first, next week, as I said, I'm going to talk about political economy. There's a lot more research using individual level frameworks based on psychology, focusing on ethnocentric tendencies or in-group, out-group views, and how those are going to shape public support for different policies in the context of trade or immigration. And we'll talk a lot about that next week. And on Thursday, we're going to talk about leaders. And here, one of the main aspects that is addressed is different levels of experience, whether it is political experience, diplomatic experience, military experience. The argument is that leaders with the relevant experience are more likely to follow the rational model and engage in strategic reasoning. But there's a lot of research that shows that this is not necessarily the case. For example, a study from 2017 has looked at the interactions of a foreign policy experience along with an environmental factor, which in this case was the small group strategic structure, and the decision to engage in the Iraq wars, comparing the choice by President Bush in the early 1990s and his son Bush in 2003. The main argument that this study specifically showed and emphasized the effect of experience is that the younger Bush had a lot less foreign policy experience, which means he relied a lot more on those small groups that made the decision. Those groups were not as diversified in terms of the different opinions were, so that led to a very certain policy options that were offered, eventually the Iraq war. And comparing that to the level of foreign policy experience that Bush Sr. had, he had a lot more experience. The decision-making group that he was part of was a lot more diverse, and his decision eventually was on some levels similar, but on some levels different from the younger Bush. But again, the idea behind this research, and I can send you this research if you're interested in that, you're more than welcome to talk to me about that, is that the individual trait of foreign policy experience work together with the situational or environmental factor of the small group decision structure to affect the final decision that was taken. By the younger Bush, it was a decision which was, in that case, less than optimal. That's it. So more research on political psychology if you want to read. So I gave you here the references for the heuristics paper, the early heuristics paper, which is actually a short one, a very interesting one if you want to read. The anger and support for drones as a counterterrorism policy is the Fisk and Merola paper. And one more study about social preferences and rational or less rational behavior in international politics. That's all I have for today. And I will see you on Thursday. See you, everyone.